The crack of rifle fire split the Montana dawn like thunder, sending a flock of ravens screaming into the blood-orange sky. Thomas McKenna pressed himself against the rough bark of a cottonwood, his violin case clutched to his chest like a shield. Through the morning mist, he could see the blue uniforms of cavalry soldiers advancing across the valley, their sabers glinting in the early light. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, he whispered in his thick Irish brogue, watching as smoke rose from what had been a peaceful Lakota camp just hours before. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with something else, something that made his stomach turn. He'd smelled it before, back in Chicago during the epidemic. The smell of sickness. Of death approaching. Thomas had been traveling for 3 days without proper rest, his boots worn thin from walking the endless prairie. He'd followed the sound of drums the night before, hoping to trade a tune for a meal and a warm place to sleep. Instead, he'd found himself witnessing something that would haunt him until his dying day. A young Lakota warrior emerged from behind a cluster of buffalo hide teepees, carrying a small bundle wrapped in colorful blankets. Even from this distance, Thomas could see the child's face was pale as winter snow, lips tinged blue, small body convulsing with fever. The warrior's eyes swept the battlefield desperately, searching for safety that didn't exist. Sergeant Mitchell. The commanding officer's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Secure the perimeter. I want every last one of them rounded up for transport to the reservation. Thomas felt his hands trembling. He'd seen this before, this systematic destruction of families. His own wife and daughter had died not from bullets, but from disease and desperation in the crowded tenements of Chicago. The same hollow look in that warrior's eyes had once stared back at him from his shaving mirror. The horses were the first thing that struck him as strange. Despite the chaos of battle, despite the smell of gunpowder and blood, the Lakota horses stood eerily calm. Their usual wild-eyed panic in the face of gunfire was absent. Instead, they moved with an almost supernatural tranquility, their ears pricked forward as if listening to something only they could hear. An elderly Lakota man emerged from the largest teepee, his weathered face bearing the distinctive scars and markings of a medicine man. His gray braids were adorned with eagle feathers and small bones that clicked softly as he moved. Despite the soldiers advancing toward him, he showed no fear. His dark eyes were fixed on the sick child, and his lips moved in what Thomas assumed was prayer. Tetenkanajan, the warrior called out, his voice breaking with desperation. She burns with the white man's fever. The spirits, they do not answer. The old medicine man approached the child, placing gnarled hands on her forehead. When he pulled them away, Thomas could see they were shaking. Not from fear, but from something deeper. Something that looked like defeat. The old ways fail us, nephew, the medicine man said in heavily accented English, his voice carrying across the morning air. This sickness, it is not of our world. Thomas found himself stepping forward before his mind could stop his feet. Something about the scene pulled at him, reminded him of holding his own daughter as she burned with fever, watching helplessly as she slipped away despite all his prayers and desperate bargains with God. You there? A soldier's voice rang out. Halt! But Thomas kept walking, his violin case now feeling heavy in his hands. As he approached the small group, he could see the child more clearly. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, her black hair matted with sweat, tiny fists clenched as her body fought a losing battle against the disease. I'm not armed, Thomas called out, raising his free hand. I'm just a musician. The commanding officer, a stern-faced man with graying whiskers, studied Thomas with suspicious eyes. What's your business here, civilian? I heard the child was sick, Thomas replied, surprising himself with his boldness. I've seen this fever before. In Chicago. Maybe I can help. The Lakota warrior who held the child looked between Thomas and the soldiers, confusion and desperation warring in his expression. The medicine man, Tetenkanajan, fixed Thomas with a penetrating stare that seemed to look straight through to his soul. You speak of help, Wasiku, the old man said, using the Lakota word for white man. But your people bring only death. Thomas knelt slowly, setting his violin case on the ground between them. The morning sun caught the worn brass clasps, making them gleam like small suns. My people took everything from me too, grandfather. My wife. My daughter. They died from fever just like this one. The medicine man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Around them, the strange calm among the horses seemed to intensify. Even the cavalry mounts had stopped their nervous pawing and stood still as statues. What do you propose to do? The commanding officer demanded. We have orders to move these people to the reservation. The child can receive medical attention there. Thomas looked at the small, fevered face of the child and saw his own daughter, Bridget, in her final moments. The memory hit him like a physical blow, but with it came something else. A melody. The same Irish lullaby he'd played for Bridget every night, the tune his own mother had hummed to him as a child in County Cork. Without speaking, Thomas opened his violin case. The instrument inside was worn and scarred, its varnish dulled by years of travel and hardship. But when he lifted it to his chin and drew the bow across the strings, the sound that emerged was pure and haunting, carrying across the prairie like the voice of something divine. The effect was immediate and profound. The sick child's convulsions slowed, her rapid breathing becoming deeper and more regular. The horses, already strangely calm, now stood with their heads lowered, as if in reverence. Even the soldiers seemed affected, their tense postures relaxing slightly. But it was the old medicine man's reaction that sent a chill down Thomas's spine. Tutankhamun's eyes had gone wide, and he was staring at Thomas as if seeing a ghost. The prophecy, the old man whispered in Lakota, then switched to English. The prophecy speaks of a voice that will calm the thunder horses before the great choosing. Thomas continued playing, lost in the melody and the memories it carried. He didn't notice the way the morning mist seemed to swirl around his violin, or how the ravens had returned to perch silently in the cottonwoods, their black eyes fixed on the scene below. He didn't see the way some of the soldiers exchanged nervous glances, or how the commanding officer's hand had moved instinctively to his holstered pistol. What he did notice was that the child's fever seemed to be breaking. Color was returning to her cheeks, and her eyes, which had been rolled back in delirium, now focused on his face with remarkable clarity. "Uncle," she whispered to the warrior holding her, her voice barely audible above the violin's song. "The music, it speaks of home." The melody Thomas played was simple, just an old Irish air his mother had taught him. But somehow, in this place, at this moment, it seemed to carry the weight of every lullaby ever sung, every prayer ever whispered over a sick child, every desperate hope of a parent watching over their little one. As the last note faded into the morning air, an unnatural silence fell over the camp. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, as if the entire prairie was holding its breath. Then, from somewhere in the distance, came an answering sound. Low and rhythmic, like the beating of a great heart. It took Thomas a moment to realize what it was. War drums. The commanding officer's face went pale. "Sergeant Mitchell, how many warriors did we count in this camp?" 47, sir." "All accounted for. Then who the hell is making that noise?" Tutankhamun slowly rose to his feet, his weathered face transformed by something that might have been hope or might have been fear. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made everyone present lean in to listen. "The drums do not come from this camp, soldier. They come from the sacred hills. From the place where my people go to die." He looked directly at Thomas, his dark eyes reflecting depths of knowledge that made the Irishman's soul shiver. "The music has awakened something that has slept for generations. Something that was waiting for the right song." The sound of the drums grew louder, more insistent, and now Thomas could hear something else beneath them. Hoofbeats. Hundreds of them, coming from the north where the hills rose dark against the sky. The child in the warrior's arms sat up fully now, her fever clearly broken, her dark eyes bright and alert. She looked at Thomas with an expression far too old for her 7 years. "Ayanna sees the truth now," she said, her English surprisingly clear. "The music maker carries the voice of the ancestors. He will help our people find the way home." As if in response to her words, the horses around the camp began to move. Not in panic or fear, but with purpose. They formed a loose circle around the small group, their movements synchronized as if choreographed by an invisible hand. Thomas felt the world shifting around him, reality bending like heated metal. Nothing about this situation made sense anymore. The child's miraculous recovery, the strange behavior of the animals, the drums echoing from hills that should have been empty, all of it pointed to something beyond his understanding. "Sir," one of the younger soldiers called out, his voice tight with fear. "You need to see this." Everyone turned to look where the soldier was pointing. On the horizon, silhouetted against the morning sky, riders were emerging from the hills. Dozens of them, moving in perfect formation, their war paint visible even at this distance. But there was something wrong with the picture. Something that made Thomas's blood run cold. The riders were too far away to be heard, yet the sound of their horses' hooves was growing louder by the second. And the horses themselves moved with the same supernatural calm that had affected the animals in the camp. "This is impossible," the commanding officer muttered, raising his field glasses to his eyes. "The nearest Lakota camp is 50 miles from here." Tatanka smiled, an expression both terrible and beautiful. "Distance means nothing when the spirits ride, soldier. The music has called them home." Thomas lowered his violin, his hands shaking now not from fear but from the magnitude of what he was witnessing. Somehow, impossibly, his simple Irish lullaby had set in motion events that would reshape the fate of everyone present. The child, Ayanna, reached out and touched his hand with her small fingers. Where her skin met his, Thomas felt a jolt of energy that seemed to connect him to something vast and ancient. "The battle has not yet begun, music maker," she said, her young voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "But when it comes, your song will decide who lives and who finds the spirit trail." As the mysterious riders drew closer and the drums continued their relentless rhythm, Thomas realized that his wandering days were over. Whatever was about to unfold in this godforsaken corner of Montana territory, he was now irrevocably part of it. The calm before the storm was ending, and the real story was just beginning. The riders emerged from the morning haze like specters born from the earth itself, their painted faces and feathered headdresses creating an otherworldly silhouette against the pale sky. Thomas counted at least 60 warriors, but something about their approach defied everything he knew about cavalry tactics or Indian warfare. They moved in perfect silence despite the thundering hoofbeats that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Form defensive positions," the commanding officer barked, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. Colonel Harrison had spent 15 years fighting on the frontier, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for warriors who rode without war cries, whose horses moved like shadows across the prairie grass. The soldiers scrambled to obey, but their movements seemed clumsy and slow compared to the fluid grace of the approaching Lakota. Thomas noticed something else that made his skin crawl with unease. The cavalry horses, normally steady and well-trained under fire, were becoming increasingly agitated. They stamped and wheeled, their eyes rolling white with terror, as if they could sense something their human riders could not. "Steady, boys!" Sergeant Mitchell called out, fighting to control his own mount. "Remember your training." But training meant nothing in the face of the impossible. As the mysterious warriors drew closer, Thomas could see that their horses moved without the usual clouds of dust that should have risen from their hooves. They glided across the prairie like boats on still water, their riders sitting motionless in their saddles, faces painted in patterns that seemed to shift and change in the uncertain light. Ayanna, the child who had been near death just minutes before, stood now in the circle of her uncle's arms with the strength and alertness of perfect health. Her dark eyes tracked the approaching riders with an intensity that unsettled Thomas deeply. "They come for the choosing," she said, her young voice carrying clearly across the camp despite the growing chaos. "The ancestors ride with them now." Tatanka raised his weathered hands toward the sky and began to chant in Lakota, his voice weaving through the morning air like smoke. The horses in the immediate camp, those that had been so strangely calm during Thomas's violin performance, now began to move in slow, deliberate circles around the small group of teepees. "What in God's name is happening here?" Colonel Harrison demanded, his service revolver drawn but clearly unsure where to aim it. The approaching warriors were still too far away for effective rifle fire, but close enough now that individual faces could be distinguished beneath their war paint. Thomas felt the weight of his violin in his hands and realized he was still holding it, bow poised over the strings as if his body knew something his mind had not yet grasped. The instrument felt different now, heavier somehow, as if it had absorbed some essential quality from the music he had played for the sick child. The prophecy speaks of a great choosing, Tatanka said, lowering his hands but continuing his steady chant. When the thunder horses grow silent and the spirit riders come from the sacred hills, one voice will determine the fate of both peoples. Prophecy. Colonel Harrison spat. Sergeant, prepare for defensive fire. Whatever trick these savages are planning, will not be caught off guard. But as the soldiers raised their rifles, something extraordinary happened. The approaching warriors suddenly stopped, their horses coming to a perfect halt as if responding to a single, silent command. They sat motionless on the prairie, a line of painted death stretched across the horizon, waiting. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any war cry Thomas had ever imagined. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and the nervous whickers of the cavalry horses. Then, from the center of the warrior line, a single figure began to ride forward. He was an enormous man, his chest bare except for a complex pattern of scars and paint that seemed to tell a story of countless battles. Eagle feathers cascaded from his black hair, and around his neck hung what appeared to be the claws of a great bear. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, moved with the same supernatural calm that had affected all the animals in Thomas's vicinity. Chief Running Bear, Tatanka whispered, his voice filled with reverence and fear in equal measure. He who speaks with the spirits of the old ones. The chief rode to within 30 yards of the camp before stopping. His eyes, dark as winter nights, swept over the soldiers, the teepees, the small group gathered around the sick child. When his gaze finally settled on Thomas, the Irishman felt a shock of recognition, as if he were staring into the face of someone he had known all his life. The music maker, Chief Running Bear said, his English heavily accented but clear. You carry the voice that calls to the ancestors. Thomas found himself stepping forward, his violin still in his hands. I only played a song for the child. A lullaby my mother taught me in Ireland. The chief's painted face remained impassive, but something shifted in his dark eyes. The spirits do not care what land taught you the melody, Wasiku. They hear only the truth in your heart. The same truth that flows in the blood of all peoples who have lost their children to the white man's sickness. Colonel Harrison stepped between Thomas and the chief, his revolver trained on the warrior's chest. This is United States territory, and you are in violation of the treaty. Return to your reservation immediately, or face the consequences. Chief Running Bear regarded the colonel with the same expression he might have given a barking dog. Treaties are words on paper, soldier. The spirits recognize only the law of the heart. He raised his right hand, and immediately the line of warriors behind him began to move forward, their horses stepping in perfect unison. Take aim, Colonel Harrison commanded. But as the soldiers prepared to fire, the most extraordinary thing Thomas had ever witnessed began to unfold. The cavalry horses, which had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the confrontation, suddenly fell completely silent. Their ears pricked forward, their heads turned toward Thomas, and they stood as still as statues carved from stone. At the same moment, every horse in the Lakota camp began to move in slow, synchronized circles around the teepees. The warriors' mounts on the horizon mirrored this movement, creating a vast wheel of horses with the camp at its center. Dear God, Sergeant Mitchell breathed. The horses, what's wrong with the horses? Ayana, the child whose fever had broken to Thomas's music, walked forward until she stood between the two groups of armed men. Despite her small size and tender age, her presence seemed to command the attention of every person present. The choosing comes now, she said, her voice carrying with supernatural clarity. The music maker must play the song of decision. His melody will tell the horses which path to take, and the horses will tell the spirits which people deserve to live. Thomas felt the bow trembling in his hands. I don't understand. I'm just a musician. I played for a sick child, nothing more. Chief Running Bear dismounted from his black stallion and walked slowly toward Thomas, ignoring the rifles trained on him. Your song called the fever from the child's body. It brought peace to animals that know only fear of death. You carry the voice of healing, music maker, but healing sometimes requires choosing who lives and who dies. "This is madness," Colonel Harrison declared, but Thomas noticed that the officer had lowered his weapon. The strange calm that had settled over the horses was beginning to affect the humans as well. Tatanka stepped forward, his weathered face grave with the weight of ancient knowledge. "Long ago, when the world was young, the spirits gave our people a prophecy. They said that when the white man's sickness threatened to destroy all the children of the earth, a voice would come that could speak to both the hearts of men and the souls of animals. This voice would have the power to choose which path the people would walk." Thomas looked around at the faces surrounding him, the painted warriors, the uniformed soldiers, the small Lakota family that had welcomed his music. All of them were watching him with expressions of desperate hope mixed with terrible fear. "What happens if I don't play?" he asked. Chief Running Bear's expression remained impassive, but his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Then both peoples die. The soldiers will fire upon my warriors. My warriors will respond. The horses, driven mad by the smell of blood and the sound of gunfire, will carry death across the prairie until nothing remains but bones and sorrow." Thomas raised his violin to his chin, feeling the familiar weight of the instrument against his shoulder. But as he prepared to draw the bow across the strings, he realized he had no idea what to play. The Irish lullaby had worked for the sick child, but what melody could possibly resolve a standoff between two peoples who had been at war for generations? "Play from your heart, music maker," Ayanna said, her young voice cutting through his uncertainty. "The horses will understand." As Thomas drew the bow across the strings, the first notes that emerged were not the Irish lullaby of before. Instead, he found himself playing something he had never heard before, a melody that seemed to flow directly from some deeper part of himself. The music was haunting and complex, weaving together themes that spoke of loss and hope, of ancient wisdom and new possibilities. The effect on the horses was immediate and profound. The cavalry mounts, which had been standing in perfect stillness, began to turn slowly toward the line of Lakota warriors. Not in attack, but in recognition, as if greeting old friends after a long separation. At the same time, the warriors' horses began to move forward, but their approach was no longer threatening. They came slowly, peacefully, their riders maintaining their proud postures but lowering their weapons. "What's happening?" Colonel Harrison whispered, his voice filled with awe and confusion. Tatanka smiled, his weathered face transformed by an expression of deep satisfaction. "The horses remember the old covenant. Before the white man came with his wars and his boundaries, all horses were one people. They served any rider who showed them respect, regardless of the color of his skin." As Thomas continued to play, the two groups of horses began to mingle freely. Cavalry mounts and Indian ponies touched noses in greeting, while their riders watched in stunned silence. The music seemed to dissolve not just the tension between the animals, but something deeper, the artificial divisions that men had created between themselves. Chief Running Bear walked slowly among the intermingled horses, his hand touching first a cavalry mount, then one of his own warriors' ponies. "The spirits speak clearly," he said. "The music maker's song reveals the truth that both peoples have forgotten. We are not enemies by nature, but by choice." Colonel Harrison lowered his revolver completely, his face showing the confusion of a man whose entire worldview was being challenged. "I don't understand what's happening here. My orders were clear: relocate the natives to the reservation." "Your orders came from men who have forgotten the old ways," Chief Running Bear replied. "But the spirits remember. And now, through the music maker's song, the horses remember as well." Thomas let the melody fade gradually, the last notes hanging in the air like morning mist. As silence returned to the prairie, he was amazed to see that the two groups of armed men were no longer facing each other in hostile formation. Instead, they stood mixed together, soldiers and warriors side by side, all of them focused on the peaceful communion of their horses. Ayanna, the child whose recovery had started this extraordinary chain of events, walked up to Thomas and placed her small hand on his arm. "The choosing is complete, music maker. The horses have chosen the path of peace." But even as the words left her lips, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the prairie from the direction of the nearby town. Colonel Harrison's head snapped up, his military training reasserting itself. "That's coming from Fort Mackenzie," he said. My men are under attack. Chief Running Bear's expression hardened. Not attack, soldier. Rescue. While you pursued my small band, the real war party surrounded your fort. They do not know of the choosing that has happened here. The colonel's face went pale as the implications sank in. His pursuit of this small Lakota group had been a diversion, drawing most of his forces away from the main garrison. Now his remaining men were trapped and outnumbered. We have to get back, Colonel Harrison said, but his horse remained perfectly calm, showing no inclination to move toward the sound of battle. Chief Running Bear mounted his black stallion and rode close to Thomas. The music maker's song has shown us a new path, but not all of my people have heard it. The war chief who attacks your fort is my brother, but he follows the old way of endless fighting. Only your music can reach him now. Thomas felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on his shoulders. You're asking me to ride into a battle and convince warriors to stop fighting with a violin? I am asking you to save both peoples from destroying themselves, Chief Running Bear replied. The horses will carry us swiftly to the fort, but without your music to calm the hearts of the warriors, we will arrive only in time to count the dead. As if in response to the chief's words, Thomas's own horse, a cavalry mount he had borrowed for his journey, stepped forward and lowered its head in invitation. Around the camp, all the horses, both cavalry and Lakota, were moving into formation for a desperate ride toward the distant sound of gunfire. Colonel Harrison approached Thomas, his face showing the strain of a man grappling with concepts far beyond his military training. I don't know what's happening here, or how you did what you did, but if there's a chance to save my men without a massacre. Thomas secured his violin in its case and mounted his horse. As he settled into the saddle, he felt the animal's unusual calmness, as if the music he had played had created a permanent bond between them. The song must continue, Ayanna called out as the mixed group of riders prepared to depart. Play as you ride, music maker. Let the music reach the fort before the killing begins. And so, as the most unlikely cavalry in the history of the American frontier thundered across the Montana prairie, Thomas McKenna played his violin. The melody that flowed from the instrument was the same haunting tune that had broken a child's fever and brought peace between ancient enemies. As they rode, the music seemed to expand, carried on the wind far beyond the reach of normal sound. Behind them, the sun climbed higher into the clear sky, illuminating a scene that would never be recorded in any official military report or tribal history. But the horses would remember. And in the years to come, when tensions rose between the peoples of the frontier, old-timers would speak of the day when an Irish fiddler tune had shown them all a different way to live. The battle at Fort McKenzie still raged ahead of them, but Thomas knew now that his wandering days were truly over. He had found his purpose in this vast, harsh land, and it was simpler and more complex than anything he had ever imagined. He was to be a bridge builder, using the universal language of music to remind people of their shared humanity. As they crested the final hill before the fort, the mixed band of former enemies rode together into whatever fate awaited them, guided by a melody that spoke of healing, hope, and the possibility that even the deepest wounds could be made whole again.